beautiful people. I am Oliver Perrin for Semiogogue, joined today by Antaios, a person that I first saw speaking on J.F. Gariepi's public space. He was sharing his thoughts and his researches on the French Revolution. I enjoyed listening to that. I know a bit about that period of history, but he knows more and has been looking into it personally of late. And we began to talk after I had heard him over on JF's program, and we conceived the crazy idea of looking into a rather recondite subject, a rather occult, a rather hidden, a rather challenging subject, which we have decided to title Light in the Darkness, Uncovering the Hidden Hands of Secret Societies in Western History. Now, this undertaking, much like the title, is going to be a bit of a mouthful. I think it's going to be a heap of work, but we hope, or we envision, breaking this up into a number of discussions over a period of time. I expect there'll probably be an hour or less for each one of these discussions, but we hope to cover a whole lot of interesting stuff that we are going to review in this brief discussion today. So what you're going to hear about today is basically going to be an introduction to what all of this that we're going to do in the future is about. Before we jump to that, please do follow this channel, Semiogogue, as well as A Safer Space. You can do that on YouTube. You can do that on BitChute. Also on Minds. I'm on Gab. I'm on Twitter. For those who wish to support the channel, there is both GoFundMe and Subscribestar. For those who do support the channel, as always, all of the credit and none of the blame. So now we jump over to Light in the Darkness, Uncovering the Hidden Hands of Secret Societies in Western History. I'm joined here by Antaios. Thank you for your patience, sir, as I opened up with all of that. Now, I am going to jump to this rough outline that we've laid out, but before I do so, perhaps you can just quickly introduce yourself and let everybody know why this topic is interesting to you.
Sure. I recently left academia. I'm a German guy. I studied history for 8 long years. And finally, I ended up on YouTube talking about academic historical issues. I'm mostly interested in European modern history. I speak and read some European languages. And I started it all off, as you already mentioned, on JF's channel, jfg.world, where I first talked about China and China's role in the modern times, and then about the French Revolution. And hopefully we can really discover some of the hidden hands of secret or discrete societies in European history and how they are all related to mysticism, Kabbalah, magic, and astrology.
And political events and how they unfold around us, perhaps like a hidden hand. And yeah, you're quite right. There was the one on China. I believe that was the first one I had heard about, because you had pointed out there was that one guy who had been trained in the imperial service and sort of broke away from it and had his own sort of early form of some sort of proto-communism, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So what he did, he read a lot about Marx and about the utopian theories, and he came up with the idea that a world state should be created where private property is abolished, where the races are abolished, and this happens in 1900. So he was pretty much ahead of his time. You could really call him one of the forerunners of the United Nations. His name escapes me at the moment.
Well, I'll jump in and say, because we have so much to cover here. Look at head over to the public space. And it's one of the discussions with Antaios. Hopefully it's there. If it's not, it'll be over on BitChute. While I'm talking, maybe you can dig it up and tell people the title. But please do go check it out, everyone. It was a very interesting discussion that Antaios had with JF on China And there are also those ones on the French Revolution I mentioned, which are also informative. They're great for listening to in the background, to unfold information and understanding in areas that might have hitherto been hidden in darkness.
And now his name comes back to me from the ether. It's Kang Yo Wei, Kang Youwei, Kang Yo Wei.
And there we have it, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so we have, again, go check out the stuff on the French Revolution and on China. But now I have Antaios before us to dig into this project that we will be unfolding here on a Semiogogue. And we've got a rough sort of outline here, and feel free to jump in wherever you like, Antaios. But the basic idea, as I understand it, and this will help us to sort of get our heads aligned on this, we're going to be talking about occult channels of influence. We're going to be taking a look at the way in which people seek through secret, or at least secretive, or at a minimum, at least private organizations to establish new political orders. We're going to be taking a look at, the dimension of it that is pragmatic, that has to do with realpolitik, like bringing down a government or building a new government or creating new social institutions, in behind the scenes ways. But there's also a dimension of it that seems like it's going to be, the utopian religious visions or ideas to create a new world, or, ushering in the millennium, eschatological enterprises, these sorts of things. So one central distinction I see here is between secret services, that's the more political, obviously, power-driven, worldly undertaking. So a secret service would be like, MI5 or MI6 or Shin Bet or Mossad or the CIA or whatever. These are secret organizations that are supposed to further aims and ends. Now, these, I think for our purposes, we're going to think about as being distinct from secret societies like Freemasons or the Illuminati, or and groups that may have even magical aims or goals or have to do with esoterica and the rest. And of course, one of the things we're going to have to explore is this idea of secret itself. Is it merely a private organization? Where they don't let anybody know that you're a member, or is it really secret where they're trying to hide it? Is the membership known, but maybe the ends of the organization are kept secret? So that's sort of an opening thing with a division that I see here before we get to the outline. Is there anything you want to add or clarify or take issue with or suggest an alternative to?
Sure, no, I totally agree with what you just said, but I would just like to mention that these kind of discrete and secret societies are actually with us to this day. I mean, as you mentioned, we have the secret services like the CIA, MI5, MI6. But then, for instance, in the US, we have discrete societies which are of major influence. I mean, think of Skull and Bones, where the Bush family is a member, or think of, how is it called, Bohemian Grove, where also the Bushes are members. Arnold Schwarzenegger, the former governor of California, is a member, and who not. And then there are also the secret societies that we don't know about. Because the special thing about a secret society is that nobody knows it exists. And once its existence is revealed, this society ceases to function. It takes on a different shape, another different form. All the archives, all the communication is going to be destroyed. And this is what we really see with the Illuminati, who were founded in 1776 by a German professor in Bavaria. And just some 15 years later, their existence is revealed. Many of their secret papers are published, they are printed, and they stop existing as a secret society. They flee to a prince who is friendly to this organization and also a member of the Illuminati. And what they do after this, we don't know.
Indeed, we don't know if they really did disappear or not. It's just the trail goes cold, right? The last track is seen, and it's just rocky ground, so we can't trace any imprints of their passing. But there are cases historically where we can see the marks of the passage, or the traces, the vestiges left behind by the operation of some of these secret societies. Now, we're going to jump to an outline here that Antaios and I have laid out in discussion one with the other. Now, part of this is going to be a journey of exploration, because there are areas that he knows quite a bit about that I do not. And I think vice versa. There are some areas where I know some things that he is not aware of, and the two of us are going to be digging into this, and I guess putting both our shoulders to turn this wheel. And it's as you're going to see here as we lay out the outline, it's a rather ambitious undertaking. So do be aware that what we're going to be looking at here is basically, we're going to be sharing with you our own journey of digging into this. And so you can think of what is going to come out with this series as being a kind of introduction to the subject matter, our sharing of notes regarding what we have found. You're going to hear a lot of names, ideas, themes, and subjects that you might not have heard of before. Because of the nature of this format, where each episode of our discussion on this subject is probably going to be an hour or less, there's only a certain amount that we can fit into that time. And there's a whole lot of ground to cover. So, think of it as an introduction to the topics, and it's going to include hints and leads for further exploration. And in particular, I believe Antaios will very kindly be putting together a bibliography. So, those who wish to dig further into this will be provided with ways to do so. And I also expect that all kinds of crazy people are going to they're going to come crawling out of the woodwork with a lot of these topics. And so we're likely to see the comment sections under these videos provide all sorts of...
I'm already looking forward to that, flat world theories and everything. And regarding the bibliography, so we're talking about old stuff right here. So all the works we're going to mention, they are in the public domain, and there's going to be a link in the bibliography that leads directly to archive.org, and you can read for yourself.
And additionally, I believe Antaios is translating some of this material. The Illuminati material is originally in German. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. So around about 1785, the Order of the Illuminati was discovered by the Bavarian authorities. And what they did is they immediately published these documents, and they are only in German, and no translation has been done yet. These are about 300 pages. I'm working on a translation. I got the first 25 pages translated, but it's going to be a tough work because they use a very strange language. They have their own cipher. Of course, it's German from like around about 200 years ago. So it has to be adjusted to the modern language, and then translating it into English is kind of tricky, but I'm working on that. And Semiogogue is helping me with reviewing and editing it. So you can look forward to this coming out maybe 3 months from now. We have to see.
Yeah, well, I'm going to be mainly doing a minor polishing. As you can tell, Antaios' English is excellent. But the really interesting thing here that I want to underscore is that we're going to hear about parts of that work that he is doing in this series, and this is going to be the first time that you're going to be able to hear about some of these things in English, because they had not previously been translated. So that is definitely something to look forward to. So how about we dive here into what we plan to cover? I believe, hadn't we decided that the first area that we want to take a look at is the Florentine Renaissance? Is that correct?
That's totally correct. And I think there's no other point to start from, because this really lays the groundwork for so much that we will see later. I mean, these Florentines, they translated like all the mystical, all the Kabbalistic, all the Neoplatonist works from Hebrew, from Greek into Latin, because at that time Latin is like English today, right? This is how you reach a wide audience. Everybody who's gone to university knows Latin, so this really opens the door for all the things that happen later. And what is maybe going to be, what do you think? What are the two most important persons of the Florentine Renaissance?
Well, didn't we settle on, Marsilio Ficino, centrally? And then, what was it? It was Pico della Mirandola. Is that not
Pico della Mirandola, sì, esatto. All right, so Marsilio Ficino, let's start off with him. So he was born, of course, in Florence, and he is a major translator. So he is the first one to translate the whole corpus of Plato into Latin. Because before, I mean, you had bits and pieces that were translated. Here we have to mention the Arabs in Spain. So, for instance, Avicenna, who already does some translations in, I think, Baghdad. But then later, Averroes in Spain and Cordoba becomes really important. And
known also as Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd, yes.
And what they do is they mainly focus on Aristotle, a little Plato here and there, but mainly Aristotle. And they write commentaries to kind of explain what Aristotle is talking about. And the Europeans, the Christians, they translate this in the, 12th, 13th century, and scholasticism comes out of it, Thomas Aquinas. But this is really much based on Aristotle. So what's happening here with Plato is a totally new thing. What is really different about Plato is his political ideal of the world, which is laid out in the Republic. The Republic is a utopian state, a utopian society where you have philosopher kings, where philosophers rule because they know best. And the distinctions between the people are totally abolished. It's only about meritocracy. Property is abolished. So if you will, it's a kind of proto-Marxism, proto-communism.
Even with communal raising of children, as I recall.
Communal raising of children and forced education. Yeah, you have all these ideas that are, for the first time, available to a learned European public. Because at the same time, of course, the printing press is invented. I mean, of course, it has been invented earlier in China, but that's the first time it gets put to use in Germany.
Right, Gutenberg, and that's also the period when we see the copperplate engravings becoming widespread, the 1460s, and we've got the Aldine press, Minutius and the rest. And there's another interesting element that I would throw in there, which is that, of course you know this, but to make sure that our listeners do as well, Cosimo de' Medici, who is the patron of Marsilio Ficino, was an enormously wealthy and powerful person, and a banker as well, and with great influence across, with his banking house and the wool trade and all the rest across Europe. So this isn't just the introduction of these long dormant ideas to a group of learned people able to put them into Latin form to share them with Europeans. This is the introduction of those ideas into the heart of the corridors of power. Now, Cosimo de' Medici was not alive for very long after Ficino began to do his translations, but his children, one of them notably Lorenzo the Magnificent, were there for much of this. So the introduction of these ideas that Antaios is talking about is interesting from the perspective he first mentioned, which is that it moved it into wider discussion among the learned of Europe, but it also introduced some of these ideas into the discourse of those who actually had the power to do something about it in terms of wealth and influence. The scholars, of course, could be influential, but that's a very different thing from being a banking house whose decision about whether or not to fund a given king could make the difference between whether they were able or unable to prosecute a war.
Yeah, and I mean, especially at that time when printing and writing was so expensive, you needed a patron. You needed either the Pope, a monarch, or somebody like Cosimo de' Medici who would fund all your studies. And Cosimo de' Medici, he was really into mysticism. So first he had Marsilio Ficino work on the translation of Plato. But then he came across a very curious document that was sent over from Egypt. And we're talking about the Corpus Hermeticus, which is about Hermes Trismegistus. So Hermes Trismegistus was considered a kind of a god in ancient Egypt. He was a mix of Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. And this work is full of Neoplatonism. It is full of ideas of the divine Trinity. It has some notions of Christianity, but in it you also find the notion that you can become a god, that a man can become a god, and that the planets, the 7 known planets, are actually living gods, and you can access them. And this introduces astrology into Western thinking. And once Cosimo de' Medici gets his hands on this manuscript, he immediately orders Marsilio Ficino to stop his translation on Plato because he fears that he might die before Ficino can translate the Corpus Hermeticus. And Ficino immediately starts translating this work, and it is published in 1471, just shortly after the invention of printing in Europe.
And it gets spread far and wide. And I don't want to stay too long on the Florentine Renaissance. We'll give you a tease of what is going to come on this topic. We've got a number of other ones that we want to cover, but I do have to add as a little closing bit here on what Antaios said, that the reason it's very odd for us to imagine that he would stop the translation of Plato in order to do something with the business of Hermes Trismegistus, or thrice great Hermes. But the reason was that they had a doctrine that they called the prisci theology, which was the idea that you had these earlier pagan learned men who were gifted with foresight and wisdom, and so they anticipated the arrival of Christ, or so the thinking went. So, Christians believed that it was the arrival of, the Christ, salvation of mankind. And so they had to go looking in these earlier thinkers for signs of the coming Christian revelation. And they also didn't have the same study under their belt in terms of the age and the transmission of these texts, and which came first, and all the rest. They had not dug into that subject, and so they frankly didn't know that that Plato had actually come before the writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, which were just a hodgepodge of all kinds of things, likely from a place like Alexandria, any number of traditions and elements mixed together. They thought that Hermes Trismegistus was the earliest of the ancient sages. And so when, as Antaios mentioned, there was this business of, little bits of Christianity here and there, early Christianity that had been mixed into those texts. But because they thought that Hermes Trismegistus came first, before the arrival of Christ and before Plato himself, they thought that it was some proof of his great insight about what was coming, when that was not the case.
Yeah, you know what is funny? They really thought that Hermes Trismegistus lived before Moses. Yeah, so like 4,000 years ago. But the fact is that the manuscript was written in Greek. So it's totally impossible that he lived during the time of Moses.
Oh yeah, and in fact, we know that the authors of it didn't, but it's a situation where there was a lot of confusion about this, and the one of the interesting side effects of this is that this text, the group of texts called the Corpus Hermeticum, were given much more weight and were considered to be much more important than Plato, than Aristotle, than any of them, and so that had a great deal to do with how much interest was shown in these texts and how much influence they exerted upon all that came after them, after this period of the Florentine Renaissance and the translation. Now, we did at the outset mention both Marsilio Ficino and one of his very, very talented proteges, Count of Mirandola, Pico. We don't have time to go into him at length at the moment, but he was famous for having come up with 900 theses, a whole lot to do with syncretism. We're going to be talking about that when we come to discuss this section, because not only do you have the syncretism that you find in the Corpus Hermeticum, but you have the syncretism which is inherent in Pico's work. So a lot of things that we think about the occult today, how you take different traditions from everywhere, how you could be looking at some Greek philosophy, you could be looking at Pythagoreanism, and you could be looking at Arab interpretations of texts from the classical world on magic and astrology and Kabbalah and all these things coming together. That syncretism, though there are elements of it in the past, certainly in Europe, achieved the form that we think of it. And that I shouldn't say it really appeared first there, because in the Hellenistic world, there was quite a bit of it going on. But the last great synthesis, the last great efflorescence of syncretism that we're still surfing today comes out of that Florentine Renaissance. But we could talk about this at length, Antaios, and indeed we will. Perhaps you can introduce people to the next thing that we will be discussing, and it's in these upcoming episodes, and we're putting that under the title, very generally speaking, of the Reformation, aren't we? What's all that going to be about?
Exactly. Now, if we hear Reformation, we would normally think about Calvin, about Luther, about Protestantism, but we want to use it a little more broadly, because we want to look at the Reformation going on within the Catholic Church and the Reformation going on without. Because within the Catholic Church, you definitely have people, very early people, like Jan Hus, who is burned at the stake in 1415 in Bohemia, today's Czech Republic, because he questions the ideas of the Church, of the Eucharist and everything. And then we also have Catholic monks, mostly Dominican friars, interestingly, like Giordano Bruno. What's this other guy? Tommaso Campanella, who writes a utopian book, The City of the Sun, I think, where he reflects on Plato's Republic, and he calls for a utopia where the differences between the sexes are abolished, where private property is abolished. And they are, of course...
And there's wives held in common, right?
Wives shared in common. I mean, that sounds good to me.
The early example of wife swapping, right?
I mean, the abolishment of property, I don't like that one. But and also, I think forced education or something like that. Well, that is, of course, advocated for by Plato. So we do see this proto-communism that's really wrapped into Plato. For example, here we have...
in that period, we have a lot of the intrigue, right, of the different power bases that are at each other's throats, right? I just want to, I don't want to stop you, but I want to weave in the elements of the secret societies and the secret services. So you have the more tangible political attempts to influence what's going on, and we might see some of that in this sort of Reformation period with very broadly speaking, again, we're using Reformation as a very broad indicator, but you get somebody like Henry VIII splitting off from the Church of Rome, and then his daughter Elizabeth, and she's got a spy master, or Walsingham, who's attempting to exert influence in very sneaky ways, like a secret service would do, but applied back then with networks of spies. But he in turn is related to these, or at least arguably was working with these people who are thought today to have been spies. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about that angle, Antaios, because I know it's been argued that Giordano Bruno himself was a spy, possibly working for Walsingham or one of his underlings. And it's been suggested that John Dee was doing that as well, which ties us into a lot of areas, I think, where you know more about it being German history than I do. Maybe you can cover some of that, the Palatinate and Rudolph.
Yeah, sure. And it shouldn't come as a surprise that these Protestant states are developing secret services. Because if you compare them to the Catholic Church, of course, there are the priests, there are the Jesuits who take the confession. And what kind of information do you get when people confess to you? And to assume that this knowledge was not shared is just very naive. I mean, the Catholic Church probably had the most influential secret service in Europe at that time by a big time. And if we look at John Dee, he was actually an intelligence gatherer for Elizabeth I. He was also her court astrologer, and he was sent on a mission to Europe, where he would first land in the Netherlands and then go to Prague, where Rudolf II resided, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was a Catholic of the House of Habsburg, but who was very open to ideas of mysticism and alchemy. And Prague at that time was really a hot spot for Protestants, for alchemists, and for people involved in mysticism.
Let us say people of heterodox belief. And so in this period, you've got an enormous amount of tension that's been created, because there's not only the religious conflict, between Catholic and Protestant, but there are very real domains of power that correspond to these, those who hold the religious beliefs that we're talking about. And it's a time of great upheaval. And so, Dee has been sent to the continent to gather information and to talk to different rulers, perhaps to find allies, to sound people out, to find out what they may be willing to support, what they won't support. And so he's been sent off to the court of it's Rudolph II, isn't it? And the problem is that shortly after this time, Rudolph II dies. But perhaps I'm getting a bit ahead here. Is there anything you wanted to add about Dee?
Sure. So and here, of course, we can talk about John Dee, who's the court astrologer of Elizabeth I. He was very influential in the building of the British Empire. Actually, he coined the term British Empire. He introduced mathematics. He introduced navigation to sailors. But he was also very interested in alchemy and in talking to angels. And his good friend, Edward Kelly, was his medium. And together they had sessions where they used, how is this language called again? The Enochian language, right?
I believe so, yes. And inscribed tablets and the rest with these things.
Exactly. They came up with their own language in which they said they were talking to angels, and these angels were giving them answers, what they should do in political terms, what would happen in the future. So, for instance, Dee writes in his diary that the angels told him that the Spanish would invade Great Britain and how this could be averted. Anyway, so they were on their mission to the continent. And they came together with a lot of other alchemists, and finally they made their way to Prague around 1580, where Rudolf II of the House of Habsburg was ruling as the Holy Roman Emperor. And Edward Kelly actually stayed with Rudolf II to produce gold. But because his results were not satisfactory and he would not reveal the secret to Rudolf, he was put into prison. He tried to flee, broke his leg was cut off. Then he tried to flee again. He broke his other leg, which was also cut off. And this is how this story
Didn't he eventually
ends.
lose his ears, or had he lost his ears earlier?
No. He lost his ears before he met Dee. That's why he wore a cap. And,
yes, that lovely little cap that had the flaps that hung down to hide it.
And one of the nobles of Rudolf II pointed that out at court. And then Edward challenged him to a duel and killed that guy.
Did he? So old Edward Kelly was a little bit more hardcore than we might have imagined, huh?
He was a hot ass.
The earless spy and scryer. Yes, well, we have, there's a lot of things that I think we can look at in that period of the Reformation. Antaios has just tapped a few of them. We've got the Palatinate, we've got the Winter King and Queen of Bohemia, we've got the launching of the 30 Years' War, we've got Jesuit orders, which are their own kind of like secret society and service in a number of respects. The soldiers of
sorry
Christ.
That I interrupt you here, but haven't you forgotten something very important here?
I don't doubt I have, and I feel sure that you are about to tell me.
The Rosicrucians.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Here I am jumping ahead to thinking about the Freemasons and the Illuminati, which we'll shortly get to. But yes, perhaps you can say something briefly about the Rosicrucians. We've got maximum 15 minutes left, so we're going to have to go a little more quickly over these other subjects, because remember, people definitely have to walk away from this with at least an overview of the things we're going to cover. But yes, please, hit the Rosicrucians.
Sure. So the Rosicrucians are... So the first Rosicrucian manifestos are published in 1613-14. They are published in German, and they are printed and then disseminated. And there are a lot of theories about and a lot of myths about who they really are. But what we are going to do here, we are going to read these Rosicrucian manifestos as a document of the time and try to interpret in what was happening during that time. So, of course, they are published right before the 30 Years' War, which is a major conflict between Protestant and Catholic forces, mainly in Germany. And the Rosicrucian manifestos say that they were founded by a so-called Christian Rosenkreuz, which is, of course, an allusion to Christ. And this guy is said to have traveled the East. He stayed in Damascus, where he was initiated into Arab secret societies, where he learned Arab. Later, he was in Marrakesh, where he was initiated in other Arab orders. And then he just traveled Europe to cure the sick, and he founded the secret society of the Rosicrucians with 3 of his brothers who were in the same monastery as him. So
Can I just jump in here as a tiny little element? If we can see something that we'll probably see across various secret societies and their lore, certainly from this time, indeed earlier than this. We've got the idea of Arab knowledge that makes its way into Spain and gets translated into Latin. We've got knowledge that comes from the East, from Constantinople during its fall. We've got the idea of Templars who go to the Orient and discover knowledge there and bring it back, and we've, later in the subjects that we'll be discussing, we have the Freemasons and the ideas of, the East and the importance of the East and knowledge that comes from there. And again, we can see how that's related to syncretism and some of these things that we see first established with the the Florentine Neoplatonists in the Florentine Renaissance with Marsilio and Pico. So I wanted to tap that because hopefully it will become apparent to the people who are listening that there are certain consistent themes throughout this where we see, the idea of Plato and the idea of communal property and the Republic, and then, somebody like a Tommaso Campanella who wants to create a new society and a new world. And indeed, we see the vision of a new society and a new world behind much of what's going on with the Protestant movements. And now coming back to our Rosicrucians, I'm sorry, I'll pass the torch back to you so we can shed light on the darkness. We see these same themes.
Sure, and the Rosicrucians, they call for a Generalreformation, a general reformation. And they say that they only have 2 sacraments. And what this tells us is that they are actually Calvinists, because the Catholics have 7 sacraments and the Lutherans have 3 sacraments. The 3 sacraments of the Lutherans are actually the Eucharist, baptism, and the confession. Because Luther, even after he published his thesis, he still did the confession and he urged people to confess. And the Rosicrucians, so we really see they are on the Calvinist side. And right in the beginning of their manifestos, they talk very negatively about the Jesuits. So what we see, they are linked to Calvinism. And probably the most influential Calvinist monarch on the European continent was Frederick V, also known as the Winter King. Now, does that ring a bell with you?
It certainly does with me, because he's the one who was, what was his name? James of England and Scotland gave his daughter Elizabeth to Frederick. So we see an interesting potential Protestant alliance there. And we also see sort of the outlines beginning to appear in what you've mentioned of this business of sort of Jesuits versus Rosicrucians. If we can believe what we're told, that's at least a possibility. So it's almost like competing secret societies. Now, I hate to do this to you, but I think we're going to have to jump over because we've only got about 10 minutes left, and we have to cover the Freemasons, the American Revolution and the Illuminati, and the French Revolution, at least in some general sense, within about 12 minutes.
Okay, let me just say this. So the connection between Dee and the Rosicrucians is that they actually take up his Monas hieroglyphic, which is a sign which Dee believed to unlock magical forces, and the Rosicrucians take that up. So here we see the
links and continuity,
here we see the links and continuity between Dee and the Rosicrucians.
Now, the interesting thing here will be to figure out, and of course, we're going to go back into each one of these subjects at length, where the goal here is just to sort of sketch these outlines. But the interesting thing is, how do we get from this period of Protestant and Catholic conflict to this period of the Freemasonic lodges? Now, remember, we're going to have to go very quickly because we have to cover the Freemasons and the American Revolution and the Illuminati and the French Revolution. And furthermore, what we might cover will be everything that comes after the French Revolution in terms of everything that we've just laid out. But how would you bridge the gap, Antaios, between this whole period of the Rosicrucians and the rest to this idea of Freemasons? Do we have any kind of indicators of any kind of continuity between Rosicrucian orders and Freemasonic orders?
I think we do, but there's also a very different way how they go about and what their ideal society and state looks like. Because if we look at Frederick V, who has definitely been influenced by Rosicrucian ideas, we see that he is trying to take over the Holy Roman Empire, because the king of the Holy Roman Empire is elected by the 7 electors. 4 of them are Catholic and 3 are Protestant. And what he does, he takes over. He is invited to Bohemia by the nobility, and he becomes king of Bohemia. And by doing this, he does not only have the vote of the Palatinate, he also has the vote for Bohemia. So at this moment, you have 4 Protestants who will elect the next king of the Holy Roman Empire, and then they would take over Germany, so to speak. And this would be a step to push out Catholicism, to push out the Jesuits out of Europe. But what we see emerging within Freemasonry is something different. It's not only about reforming Christianity. It's not only about kicking out the Jesuits. It's about getting rid of religion altogether and replacing it by either atheism or a cult of a supreme being. And
some manner of deism, or something of that sort, is it not? Because you've got the idea of like the modern Masons, the idea of the people of the book, that, you know, for example, Jews and Christians and Muslims could all be a Mason. Now, I don't know how far these particular ideas go back into some of these earlier forms of Freemasonry, but it's an interesting idea because it doesn't necessarily have to be atheistic, does it? I mean, there are different lodges. You know, you've got Scottish Rite, York Rite, and that's just in terms of English traditions of Masonry. I don't even know what's going on with the continental German lodges and the rest.
I mean, the first Freemasonry in its beginning, it is definitely the case that you have to believe in some form of God. I mean, in the beginning, atheism was totally unacceptable. But the big difference...
Grand architect, correct.
The grand architect or the supreme being. But if you look at the American Revolution, which we could call the first Freemasonic revolution, if you will, because George Washington, Ben Franklin, Thomas Paine, and lots of others were all Freemasons. And what they did, unlike the Lutherans and the Calvinists, they didn't just only kick out the Jesuits and replaced it with their own clergy, but they totally separated church and state. We
Yes,
can
indeed.
really...
I guess that hadn't really been done with the English, right? They hadn't quite gotten that far. They had established, I mean, the Church of England was essentially, I mean, the state religion, right? I hadn't even really thought about that. That was a major step for the U.S. I mean, some of the ideas were inherent in earlier English ideas, but I guess you're quite right. The Americans were the first one to come in and make it quite explicit and a foundational element, right?
And we do see that there is a link between continental Freemasonry and the Freemasonry of the Americas, because the revolutionaries could have never won the war for independence against Great Britain if it weren't for French support. And the leader of the French forces supporting the rebels was the Marquis de Lafayette, who was a Freemason. And later, during the French Revolution, the Marquis de Lafayette plays a very important role. For instance, he drafts the French Declaration of the Man and of the Citizen in 1789. And you know who aided him in writing this constitution?
Pray tell.
It was Ben Franklin, who was ambassador to France at that time. So you really see the connection between American and France Freemasonry. And if you look at the most influential figures of the French Revolution, so for instance, the Marquis de Mirabeau, Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, Danton, Desmoulins, they were all Freemasons, and a lot of them Freemasons in the very same lodge. And of course also Jean-Paul Marat, who complained that not enough heads were chopped off during the height of the terror. He was also a Freemason. So if you want to learn more about this, you can go to the public space, Jean-François Garipy, where I talk about this in detail.
And didn't he end up dead in a bathtub? A woman stabbed him to death. I'm trying to remember what happened there.
Exactly. There was Charlotte Corday. She murdered him. The Death of Marat by Jacques-Louis David. It's an amazing painting. Check it out.
That will help me to form a mental image of it. And I should say for our listeners, if anybody knows, I know there are a number of Poles who listen, but I'd be very interested to hear if you could put some remarks in the comments section about whether or not Kazimierz Pulaski, who was a Pole, who was a fighter in the American Revolution, was a Mason. I'd be interested to know whether he was a Mason. And I'd also be interested to hear from any Poles whether Masons were involved in the drafting of the Polish Constitution. I think it would fit together with the ideas that we're exploring here now. But we have literally only 2 minutes left. I know that you want to touch on the Illuminati. You had mentioned, and I hadn't been aware of this, that they were founded apparently in 1776, the same year that the American Revolution kicked off. And we've got this business of the French Revolution that we wish to explore. And there's also the stuff of what comes after the French Revolution, because there's a very tantalizing little bit there, that we initially talked about this idea of how there's a secret service, which you could think of as being spies who have tangible ends in mind relative to worldly power. And then you can think about secret societies that are more about, occult knowledge, individual development, the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel, or, however you wish to refer to it. And we have seen the way these strands intertwine. You could even say the strands intertwine with somebody like a Crowley, who recent research appears to have established was a spy as well as an occultist. But what happens after this whole period? What happens when, for example, your secret societies are entirely materialistic? So what happens, for example, in a communist country where they've dispensed with the idea of any sort of soul? Or perhaps even more tantalizing would be the question of, have they really, at the highest levels of these organizations, perhaps some of these thoughts and notions persist? I don't know. What do you think?
That is a fascinating question, Semiogogue, because, if we look at the changes that were going on in pre-modern Europe, in the Reformation era and during the French Revolution, it was always people who were into mysticism, who were into secret societies, who were practicing what they considered magic and alchemy. And they truly changed the world. Their discoveries in the sciences, in the arts, for example, Goethe was a member of the Illuminati. Isaac Newton wrote on alchemy and angels. John Dee, so to speak, founder of the British Empire, conversed with angels as he had
Wasn't Kepler trying to establish a relationship between tonal series and harmony and the distance from each other and movements of the planets? I mean, yeah, this is a consistent theme.
So how is it that the people who were shattering the world, who were writing history, who were deeply involved in mysticism, why is it that the new generation who would shatter the world, like the Marxists, the Lenins, the Stalins, the Trotskys, how is it that they were avowed atheists? Or were they? Or were they maybe behind the doors?
Or is there practicing some sort of occult tradition or something? Or do we see is it a situation of Occam's razor, where it's a simple matter of a divergence? Do we find a atheistic rationalism with a Rousseau, or at least an ostensible, a claimed atheistic rationalism with a Rousseau that sort of spawns its own aspect of this? And I don't know the answer to that question. I'm not sure you do either, but one thing that I'm interested to do is to dig and perhaps find something out. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap here because we're coming up on an hour. Just to recap, we've got this idea of light in the darkness, uncovering the hidden hands of secret societies in Western history. And I'll be talking with Antaios about this over some period of time that remains to be determined. We're going to have to figure out, with each of our conceptual buckets being needing to be fit into 1 hour episodes, it's going to take a little bit of work to figure this out. One of the reasons that we're giving you an outline here is because there's still a fair amount of reading and research we're going to have to do going forward in order to make these things, familiarize ourselves with these things in such fashion that we can talk about it intelligently. But we've got this big division between secret services and secret societies, how they influence the affairs of men, perhaps in an interrelated way that could be characterized as a trajectory, as a continuous or at least interrelated development across history. So we've got the Florentine Renaissance, we've got the Reformation, which we're using very broadly for all sorts of things, from Tommaso Campanella, Giordano Bruno, John Dee, and others. I mean, we'll probably have to take a look at figures like Paracelsus. I mean, there's any number of aspects we'll have to dig into here. We've got the Rosicrucians, the 30 Years' War, alchemical Lord Rudolph, the Emperor Rudolph. We've got the Palatinate, the Winter and King and Queen, Elizabeth, Frederick V, Jesuits, people like Athanasius Kircher, ad majorem gloriam Dei, and their chains around their thighs. And we've got the Freemasons in different areas on the continent. We've got the American Revolution, the Illuminati, the French Revolution, and more. We'll even take a look possibly at people like Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, perhaps Trithemius of Würzburg, maybe even peek at towering intellectual figures like Nicholas of Cusa, but it remains to be seen. And I will invite you, Antaios, to throw in any last words that you want to add to this. And also, if you have any online social media presence or anything like that where people can find you, please feel free to share that as well.
Sure, you can check me out on Twitter. It's ANTAE1OS. So maybe if you can put my link to Twitter into the show notes, everybody can find me there. I'm tweeting from time to time. And I would just like to shed some light on the title, Light and Darkness. We didn't only choose it because it sounds nice. I mean, it sounds nice, does it?
It does indeed.
But it actually has a deeper meaning, because we see that from Pythagoras to Plato to Adam Weishaupt, the founder of the Illuminati, to Marx, to Lenin, all these thinkers, all these revolutionaries, they were thinking of themselves, of carrying light into darkness against reactionary forces of religion and superstition, while at the same time they were working from within the shadows. For keep in mind, the Illuminati, the illuminated, were founded in secret, were founded in the darkness, and once their secret papers were seized and published, they dispersed together at a friendly duke who was also a member of the Illuminati and who protected them. So we want to shed some light on these hidden hands. So stay with us.
Absolutely. And I think there's more than a heavy dash of Manichaeism, Manichaeism, dualism, almost like the Cathares and the Albigensians and the rest. So yes, there will be much to dig into here. I hope all of you, ladies and gentlemen, will come and check it out as we hammer this into shape and fit it into its various sections. That will take some work for us, and hopefully you'll stick with us and join us. And I hope that it will be enjoyable for you. We shall see. Well, thank you, Antaios. Thank you all for listening. Until next time, I am Oliver Perrin for Semiogogue, and I am out.